Bethany Bravery here. Welcome back to another episode of the Bringing Her Hope podcast. I'm excited for you to introduce, or me to introduce you to my friend Hannah Benedict. Hannah, thanks so much for being on this podcast. We appreciate you.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
Absolutely. Why don't you tell our listeners and our viewers a little bit about yourself?
I'm a mom to two teenage boys. I was born and raised in the Pacific Northwest and love pretty much anything that gets me outside. About 5 years ago, the boys and I taught ourselves how to downhill ski with the help of some other people as well, but that's become something that we just absolutely love. So I think something to sum up myself is I just love playing, family, friends, and I think it's all a little better if we've got Jesus in the midst of it. I'm also I'm a counselor and a play therapist. I have a private practice in Hillsboro, Oregon, and I do counseling, coaching, trainings, and stuff for kids and adults.
I love that. That's awesome. And today we're unpacking the topic of how to flourish as a single parent, as a single mom. One thing that y'all may know about me is that I'm a single mom, but Hannah is as well. And so
Mhm.
I'm excited to be able to unpack this story. I was thinking about before we even got on this interview, how sometimes as single moms, we feel like we're just here to survive. And I love the concept of no, let's flourish, and what does that look like, and how do we get from the beginning of maybe the loss of divorce as God continues to take us through that journey. So Hannah, you have the floor. Why don't you share your just the journey that God's taken you on how to flourish as a single mom?
Yeah. Um, I've done a lot of praying and asking God, like, what parts to share and like what is important and what does He have? And the thing that keeps coming back up for me is just this a memory of 10 years ago, sitting across the table. We were eating breakfast, and my mom was there. My kids were 3 and 5 at the time.
Mm.
And they were off playing, doing their thing. And I was some things that had just some real darkness in our marriage had come into the light, and the death of this marriage was very much evident. And I was devastated. It was a loss of a dream from childhood. It was a loss of a really important relationship that was shifting and changing my home, what I thought life was going to look like. And I was absolutely devastated. Just the pain was deep. The loss was very real, and I felt just lost. Like, what would be next? How was I going to do this? I, at the time, was a stay-at-home mom. I had worked minimal amounts after my kids had born. Before that, I had worked in education and been a teacher. And so here I am. I've got these little kiddos, one just starting kindergarten, another one not even in preschool at the time, thinking like, what am I going to do? And as we're sitting at that breakfast table, my mom was there, and she looks across the table at me and she was like, "Hey, do you remember at Kit's funeral, the pastor talking about Lazarus?" And was my brother-in-law, and 6 years before that, he had lost his very short and intense battle with leukemia. He was 19 years old. It was devastating. I don't remember the pastor talking about Lazarus. I don't remember much details from that moment, but I trusted. I was like, yeah, it seemed like an odd thing for a pastor to talk about at a funeral, about this story where Jesus would raise somebody from the dead. But I thought, okay, Mom, sure. And she said, I really feel like God is saying that that's for you in this season. And for a long time, I really clung to that as meaning that would mean that there would be this life that came, to my marriage. That felt like the obvious death
Yeah.
in my life. And I thought, well, That's what it's got to mean. And I'll tell you that's not what it's meant. But it's been such a different journey, a different story where life has come in some really beautiful and surprising ways. So I'll back up a little bit and kind of start and give you a little bit more. So I am the oldest of three girls. We were great family, grew up in the church, loved, being outside together. We went to church Sundays, midweek, youth groups, summer camps. I went on mission trips, all the things. And as I look back, as much as I really wanted, God to be, he was important. And I really felt like I had this relationship. I also see how for so many reasons, I got this idea, this view in my head that if I did the right things, if
Mm,
I said the right things, if I prayed the right prayers, that God would answer my prayer.
yeah.
That, that's how he demonstrated and showed his love for us. I think I also look back and realize that there was always this hole inside of me wanting to know if I was enough.
Mm,
I was beautiful enough, if I was smart enough, if I was skinny enough, if I was, flirty enough or loud enough or quiet enough, or was I enough?
yeah.
And it felt like so often the quiet, the small messages kept affirming that I wasn't enough.
Mm,
And I would look for different places, and there was just this hole, and I felt really unseen and unimportant. And that left this ache inside of me that I think I was looking to fill,
mm,
to attach, to be connected to someone, something that told me that I was enough.
yeah.
And so when I was, 21, 22 years old, this guy that I'd known since I was young, since I was 13, he was the friend of or he was the cousin of one of my really good friends, started showing interest and saying those things that every girl longs to hear. And, about a year later, we were married.
Mhm.
5 years later, we had kids. We had what seemed like this really great life. There were definitely challenges and struggles, but we genuinely enjoyed each other, enjoyed our time together. We were both raised in the church. Um, but along the way, things I think kept happening to us that poked kind of holes in our faith.
Mm,
Um, going back to that idea that like if God loves me, then he'll, basically make things easy for me.
right.
I think I would hear people talk about and give testimony about how like, well, life was really hard and then God like came in and we got our house back that we, were gonna lose, or we had, no friends. Now we had friends, or we had no money. We had money. And I just felt like I always heard these like testimonies that were wrapped up in like how God saved the day, basically.
Mm,
And so when I started looking at my life, I was like, that feels really different than what I'm experiencing.
mm,
My dad, when I was 5, got really sick, and with a lot of unexplained symptoms, illnesses, weird things that would happen. His hand would go numb when he would touch newspaper. He had all sorts of pains in his body in different times and in different places, and no doctors could explain it. And we would pray and nothing would change. My mother-in-law was diagnosed with cancer when when her kids were teenagers, and for years she lived with cancer. And I don't know that I would always call it living, because it robbed her so much of life, of the things that she was passionate about. And people would pray. And of course, she didn't die, but she didn't really live for the last 5 years of her life. She was, basically in bed.
yeah.
And it robbed so much life. And I felt so much confusion
Mm,
of like, if God is loving, if he is really who he says he is, then like how, like I don't understand.
Yeah.
And so when my brother-in-law lost his battle with cancer, like it became really dark. And for a long time, could not reconcile how God could,
Mhm.
be true, could be this loving, kind, caring God if he didn't put an end to this suffering that seemed
Mhm.
senseless. And so, for about 2 years after Kit died, we didn't go to church
Mhm.
and we stopped reading our Bibles and we stopped praying and we just really kind of stopped talking about God because it felt like He had failed us.
Mhm.
And but when you have two little kids, things I feel like you kind of return sometimes to those
Mhm.
places. And so after about 2 years, we started going back to church, and I joined a book study that our church was doing. And in the book study, we read it's a book called The Shepherd's Look at the 23rd Psalm.
Mhm.
And it's this tiny little book, and it's written by a gentleman who had lived as a shepherd in like North Africa. So a similar region to where like David had lived and who wrote the 23rd Psalm. And he went through line by line and explained as a shepherd and what he knew of how a shepherd cares, what each one of those pieces were describing in God's care for us as his sheep. And it brought me to this place. It's, I think, the first time I physically remember God loves me. Like,
Mhm.
even when I'm in the valley of death, even when, there are enemies all around me, He is there. It's not about those things going away, that it's more about where He is and who I am in the midst of that.
Yeah.
And so, just a few years later, when, like I said, some things had come to light that were not healthy, did not bring life to the marriage that we had, and that ended, I was one at first devastated, but I also made a decision. I very distinctly remember making a decision to say, in the midst of this, I am going to cling to Jesus because I don't know what else to do. I've
Yep.
tried it the other way.
Yep.
It didn't work.
Yep.
I need Jesus. Um so I did, and I clung to it. And like I said, for a long time I prayed that this would mean that our marriage would resurrect, that
Mhm.
there would be new life in it.
Yeah.
And it didn't. But I have seen and I've met God in different ways. And in the process, He has done this resurrecting work on my heart.
Mm.
He exposed this life that was so consumed by fear that I wasn't necessarily living. And it wasn't like I was afraid of going outside and leaving my house. And I wasn't like overly afraid of spiders or snakes or these kind of like obvious phobias that people would say they have. I was afraid of doing the wrong thing, saying the wrong thing, being the wrong thing. And as I started to look at that, I realized, man, my fear has led me to try to control a lot of things.
Yeah.
I controlled the food that I ate. I controlled how much I, exercised. I controlled and allowed fear to dictate decisions I made about like where I would go to school and how I would travel, and or not travel was more likely the thing.
Mhm.
It kept me from doing things that were fun because I was afraid of going too fast on skis or whatever it might be.
Yeah.
And realized I one night I remember sitting down and it felt like God was saying, He led me to this verse in Psalms 34, verses 3 through 4. It says, I cried out to the Lord and He answered me and He set me free from all my fears.
Mhm.
Those who look to him for help will be radiant with joy. No shadow of shame will darken their face.
Mm.
So I thought, well, I'm going to cry out to God and I'm just going to write out all my fears. And that first night, I came up with an entire page, line, just of everything that I was afraid of. And it caught me. I was like, wow, that is a
Mhm.
lot. And I mean, I still have times that I do this even now, even 10 years later, but especially in that first couple of years, I would daily at times write out, what am I afraid about today? And
Mm.
God, would you meet me in that place? Would you show me? Would you show up? And then oftentimes I go back and I'm afraid to go travel because I'm not going to sleep well
Mm.
in the bed and then I'm going to be grumpy. And I would go back and I would be like, I slept mediocrely, but like I was okay. Like I started to, instead of being so stuck on what might happen, I started learning like I actually was going to be okay when I did these things, sometimes even better than okay. I made a fear list because I wanted to be fearless.
Mhm.
And so I took some of my big fears that had kind of stopped me from a lot of things and I started doing things to counter them. So I had this huge fear of needles. My mom tells a story of when I was like 5 and being at the doctor's and had to get a shot for something and trying to jump out the second story doctor's
Oh
office
my.
window. I was so terrified. So I got a tattoo. Like, like I was terrified, scared to make a mistake, to do something wrong, traveling outside of the country.
Mhm.
An opportunity presented itself to get to go to Peru with a group of women. And I said, okay, I'm going to do it. And I did. And it was beautiful. Just started to really like tackle these fears. Like I said, the fear going fast. I'd grown up on cross country skis, but going down the mountain was terrifying.
Yeah.
My kids said, we really want to learn. And I thought, okay, let's do it. And we did. And it turns out I actually really love it. So started, instead of seeing that as a decision to avoid, started to
Mm.
say like, this is something to actually step towards.
Wow.
What does God have for me? And I've seen that in my life as well. We have lived the last 10 years of like, oh my gosh, what's next? Like I said, when my marriage dissolved, I was a stay-at-home mom. I had no income. I had nothing. I thought, how am I going to raise
Yeah.
a 3 and 5-year-old and provide for them? And at every turn, there seemed to be the right job. I would get on like before that and I would look and I'd be on, all the job search sites and I'd think, that job, like will work, I'll be gone all hours and I won't make any money
Yeah.
enough to provide. Or, that job is great, but I'm not qualified for it. Or, and just felt like running into wall after wall. But then I'd show up at a preschool and they would be hiring. And so I would get to work, teach, actually, they paid better than I had worked, in past, and be at the same school that my preschooler was at.
Mhm.
Houses where I'm like, there's no way that people are going to rent to us. I have no income, and having landlords hand me the keys on the day that we would walk in.
Mm.
It's just been story after story. So about 5, 6 years ago, um, all along, there's been a desire to go back to school and get my master's, but I had always really struggled with, am I smart enough to do it?
Mhm.
Financially, that's a huge risk. Can I take that risk? And on paper, it looked like the smartest choice for me was to get my master's in education because it was a shorter program. And I already had taught kindergarten before my kids were born. And so it seemed like this natural, that was what my undergrad was in. Um, but deep down inside, I knew that wasn't what I was supposed to do.
Mhm.
And it took a lot of faith and courage and guts and a lot of prayer to say, I'm actually going to go after this dream of being a counselor,
Wow.
working with kids, it's 3 years instead of 2. I don't, or 1 with the education. I don't know for sure that I'll come out and have like this really like high paying job. Entry level, master's level work in counseling does not often pay very well.
Yeah.
And so it was this huge risk, but all along, like I felt like God calling me and saying like, nope, this is where I want you to walk. And all along, like if you could read my journals, there's like pages of like, I'm so scared of this and I'm so scared of that. And I'm so scared that I'm going to get done and it will be for nothing.
Mm,
I'm scared that I won't have enough time to be present with my kids as I work and go to school and do internships and do all the things. And every time those fears, as I would lay them before Jesus, would like, he'd answer in really beautiful ways. Like I said, houses, space, time, you know, like I said, I've got teenagers and I have really great kids, like who know that they are deeply loved.
mm,
Um, and I don't feel like have missed out on their mom
yeah.
even in this, because I really believe that when we submit those things, those desires that God places on our heart, that he makes the way.
Yeah.
And so, yeah, there's been sacrifices that we've all had to make that happen, but he's shown up. It's been really beautiful to see how he's done that. I'm really thankful. So, yeah, like I said, I now work as a counselor. I have a private practice. It's thriving. I have an office that's 5 minutes from my house. I can show up and take my kids to their games when I need to, or their practices, or, those things, and adjust to make that work. Their dad and I have worked really hard our marriage has not come back. There's not life in that, but we have a really good co-parenting relationship, and we have worked hard and fought hard for that, so that our kids have a really healthy, balanced, life with that. It has taken a lot of forgiveness, a lot of, laying aside my own wants at times, learning what it means to have healthy boundaries in a relationship, that feels where there's been, hurt and betrayal on both sides. How do we continue to navigate that in healthy ways? Doesn't mean that, it's back to what it was, because it can't, but we can have this purpose to work towards with our kids, to raise them well and figure out what that looks like. And there have been hiccups along the way, and there have been false starts, and there have been tears and anger and pain as we figured it out. But I'm thankful that both of us have stuck in it and committed to figuring it out.
So good. Hannah, I'm thinking about the girl that's listening or watching, and maybe she's at the very beginning stages. The papers maybe aren't even filed yet, or they've just been filed, and she's in this. I remember this season so clearly. This fog of, I don't know what's up, I don't know what's down, I don't know how to make decisions. Like, you seem so eloquent, and like everything like came together and all that. And
Yeah.
so how would you encourage her that's just getting started? Like, she also wants to flourish. She also doesn't want to just survive, but she's in this fog of, I don't know how to even make a decision. What would you say to her?
Yeah. As you're saying that, yeah, I remember those days. I remember where like there were times that I would just walk for hours, like not even knowing how I ended up in the places that I did. I think like the thoughts that come to mind are, one, like it is that continual, like I said, there was a very strong decision on my part that in the midst of this, I was going to cling to Jesus.
Yep.
that did not mean that I was going to just like pray Sunday school prayers,
So
you
good.
know,
Yep.
like, God, do this. Like, I remember one time we lived with my parents for the first 2 years, and everybody, for some reason, I was the only person in the house, which didn't happen very often,
Mhm.
and was pacing back and forth, crying out to God because I did not understand, tears to the point that my parents' dogs had run out through the dog door and they were watching me on the deck, pacing with me like, oh my gosh, that she's gone crazy, but we're going to watch her. But that's like lament. Like there's a reason why the Psalms, like David is so honest in his approach to God and how he speaks to God and the emotions that he's feeling. And I love that at the end, it always comes back to, and
Yes.
yet I will praise you, and yet you are God, and yet you made a way for the Israelites where there was no way.
Mhm.
Opened and you parted the seas. And he continually recounts God's faithfulness in those seasons. And I think that that's a big piece of it too, is even when there is death, like the Israelites kept going back and saying, like, it was so much nicer in Egypt. And God saying, I have this over here for you that looks so much different. Will you trust me? And I feel like there is this piece of like, how do I go back? How do I continually remind myself? Because when I sit and I remind myself of how good it was,
Mhm.
forget the bad or the hard or because that felt easy, or it felt like, sure, it would be a lot easier to be, married in a traditional like family type setting. There'd be easier things about that on the outside. I
Mhm.
know that it's not God's heart that this is what
Right.
happened in our marriage, but I also know that his heart is for me.
Absolutely.
Um, and so trusting him even when I can't see, like,
Mhm.
and so then it's that crying out, and then it's daring to dream and
Yes.
inviting people into that dream and letting people speak life into you. I
Mhm.
think that that's been one of those, again, if that story, if that narrative inside of me is I'm not enough,
Right.
the more I've been able to be honest with other people and saying, like, I'm really struggling to feel like I'm enough right now.
Mhm.
Not in a, will you pat me on the back and like tell me how amazing I am, but more in just, this is really honestly where I'm at.
Yeah.
Sometimes speaking that only to God and watching how he uses and prompts people in
Mhm.
my life without them even knowing, to say something, to do something to show me that way um, forward. So invite people in, invite God into those hard places.
Mhm.
Um, and then somebody once said, or something I heard, like basically, like, we can I can choose to say, oh man, like this is the worst thing ever, and live in this place of grief and
Yeah.
bitterness and, unforgiveness. Or I can say, like, that was really hard, but God, like,
Yes.
but God.
Yep. So good. Well, and I think, how you mentioned earlier in your story that longing for control, that longing for, wanting to have everything in a certain way, you went from the posture of needing or sensing this false sense of control was going to fix what you were dealing with, or you had the option of clinging to Jesus and releasing all of the control, right?
Right.
It's
Yeah.
in that desperate dependence. And I think, unfortunately, this is sad, but I feel like in a lot of people's stories, it's when everything in our lives gets stripped away.
Hmm.
We can't have our fingers on every. It's like, Jesus, take the dang wheel, because we don't know
Right.
what to do.
Yeah. 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 I remember one time walking maybe a few years into this in the woods without just walking and praying. And I felt like God just saying, like, Hannah, you need, like, walk with your hands up.
Mm,
Even when life is going good. And I need to come back. It's not that life is, great now. There are definite heartache and things that we have walked through in this last year specifically that have been hard. They have been, just really hard. And it is in those moments that, and not, and in those moments, and when things are going really well, that there is that, how do I walk? I can walk all clean together and
Mm,
I can hold my hands out. And one of the things that I think is really interesting as a counselor, I really make connections to like our whole bodies. Like, what is that like? And there is something like even noticing how you're holding yourself.
yeah.
Like I noticed even in this last year that just it felt like trauma after trauma after trauma in just our, personal lives kept happening. And I noticed after a while that I was walking like shoulders hunched in, caved in. And part of it was from an injury from a car accident that we had been in. And part of it was my body was trying to protect itself.
Yeah.
And it is like, even like just this last week of like continually remember, like it is a posture, a whole body, like opening to what God is doing.
Mm, so good. You mentioned as you were kind of describing what you would speak into that woman who feels like she's in the fog, that dreaming is really important. So if
Mhm.
you were to tangibly like think about what were some questions to even like awaken dreaming again in you, what did that look like, or what would you ask her just to get some of those juices
Yeah.
flowing again? Because sometimes that part of our, I don't know, our brain or heart kind of shuts down.
Yeah.
So I'm curious what you would say to that.
Yeah. Um, I think there's two things. I think it comes with a looking forward and a looking
Mhm.
back. So like it's looking back to like in those unabandoned times of childhood, what was life-giving and joyful to you?
Yeah.
Because no matter what, like life is just better when we play. We
Yeah.
are designed for play,
Yeah.
for, adventure. So there's this piece of like, what are the moments in your past and in your
Mhm.
present where you feel like most at rest, at peace, of this joy? And it can be these small little snippets
Yeah.
because what we focus on, what we give our attention to, that really grows. So, what is it about that? Like, what do we do to create more of that in our lives?
Mm,
Um, and it doesn't have to be, I think sometimes we think like we hear stories of like, oh, we're going to do these big, huge things. And yes, I've done some of those with like, getting a tattoo or whatever, but it's been other small things of like, I'm going to intentionally go and stand and look at something beautiful every day.
mm,
um like it's doing those, like what are the small things that you want to have more of in your life,
yeah.
and then see where it goes from there.
Yeah.
you know Not also doing, I think at one point somebody asked me just write without like judgment
Mm,
or like fear, or that it's too much, that it's crazy, that it's not even possible. Just start writing,
mhm.
and see what comes out. um, I've done like almost like vision boards at times,
Yeah.
dream boards, where like I will go and look for images in magazines. And again, no judgment. Don't go look for the perfect picture. Just look
Yeah.
for the thing that jumps out at you and then get curious afterwards. Why?
Mhm.
What about that picture like really spoke to you? What is it that you're drawn to? Where do your eyes go? Um, Noticing those things. I think it's that curiosity, like cultivating curiosity versus like it has to look this way or be this way or that's impossible, or why does it feel impossible? Get curious with that piece.
So good. So good. Okay, let's pivot a little bit to parenting and what that looks like when we're single parenting, right? It's different than you said, kind of like the hope that you had when you walked down the aisle and before the children were even born. And so for you, what has been something that has been hard about single parenting? And then what has been something that maybe has surprised you or brought you curiosity from your parenting as a single mom?
Yeah. Yeah. Um, I think the hardest piece has been not being present in every experience that my kids have. Like, I know that as kids grow that, of course we're not going to be present in all of those, but it's missing the Christmases every other year, or the Thanksgivings, or that special vacation that they went on with their dad. Or sometimes it's just that Saturday like night movie night that you didn't get to be a part of that seemed like a really special, thing for them, just because of different, parenting time and schedules. I think that that has been the hardest
Mm,
piece for me. There's oftentimes that I will, in my frustration and grief, say, this is not what I signed up for. I did not sign up to be a part-time parent. I
yeah.
signed up to be, there through it all. Um, and like, I wrestle with it. It was hard at first as we were navigating um what would it look like, what would parenting time look like, all of those pieces. um it's gotten easier because this has been our reality for 10 years, but there are still days that I wrestle with it, and that's okay.
Yeah.
Like, it is okay for me to say, this really is hard. I don't like this, but I don't want to stay there.
Mm,
So, like, in that, I have learned to grow a life like outside of, I get to develop different things in my life that maybe
mhm.
other people wouldn't have opportunity to do, because I do have these random times where my kids are not there, and I am not responsible, even if they are not there, for picking them up or
Right.
getting them to where they need to be. So what is it? What do I get to design? What do I want those times to be like and to feel
Mhm.
like? Um, and how do I foster those spaces? I will admit I have times where I do really well with it and times where it's not going so great. And I get to reevaluate and readjust. Um, yeah, I think there was another part to your question, but I don't remember it.
What's brought you, maybe almost like surprisingly amount of joy in the single
Yeah,
parenting? Yeah.
yeah. Um, the joy has been like, man, like, I really like my kids, and I really like going, like, we have done, I grew up, outside and stuff, but I was terrified for a long time to do it on my own.
Mm,
Like, as a woman, like, going camping and setting up the tent and like making sure we could build a fire and doing all of those things. And we have had so much fun figuring that out on our own. And we have had crazy mishaps and we've done, had things where they've gone crazy. But in that, like, just had fun. So, like, that's one thing that I am constantly looking for, is what are the things that we enjoy doing together.
yeah.
So even if that means like it's not my favorite, but I can tolerate it,
Yep.
because I really want to have a good relationship with my kids, and especially raising boys. I
Yeah.
have noticed that that works the best when we do things together.
Yes.
In activity, they don't crawl up on the couch and talk to me about everything very often.
Right.
But man, when we sit on the ski lift and we're riding up and down, we have great conversations.
Mm, gosh, so you're just taking advantage of those divine appointments that God's giving you and being available and ready for those. I love that. And I love the concept too that I think sometimes as single moms it can be almost tempting, maybe because we're paralyzed by fear, to put our life on hold. And
Mhm.
what I mean by that is like not doing the vacation, not learning how to. I mean, I'm a mom of a son and a daughter, and like backpacking. It was like my son wanted to go backpacking. Well,
Yeah.
we got to figure out how to do that.
Yeah,
It
exactly.
doesn't mean
Yeah.
that it has to be put on hold. And But you're right. It's in those moments that maybe everything doesn't go perfectly, that kind of bonding actually happens deeper than maybe it would have ever before.
Yeah, yeah. There's something about learning something together, but not always going, a little bit like, problem solving and trying to figure it out and learning. And then like them having more wisdom about something because maybe they go research out the tents that you're going to
Yes.
buy or something like that.
Yep.
Um, so they have more buy-in in it versus you saying like, yep, I know all this. Here's all the things.
Yep.
Like you've done it together.
I love that. And let's end on this question. If you could encourage maybe someone who's listening who doesn't yet have a healthy co parenting relationship, now we can't control the other person, but what is something that they can do to pour into that relationship in a healthy way?
Yeah. Um, a really healthy mindset for me has been that we are still a family unit
Mm,
that happens to live in two households.
mhm.
And that in those households, there will be the thing that is constant is that my kids are in both of those households. The rules, the expectations, those things might be different,
Mhm.
but that does not negate that we are not a family unit, that
Yeah.
they just happen because that mindset for me has taken away this like competition,
Mm,
like dad and mom, and dad does this and mom does that. Like it has helped me view this is their whole life.
yeah.
I'm this part of it, he's this part of it. Um, so that mindset, it's something that when I work with families that are either have been through a divorce and, working with the parents in that co-parenting relationship, in my professional work, or it's a family that's coming in saying like, this is something that our family is going to start walking through. That is something I share. And it often like, I notice even like this physical like change in people's bodies of like, okay, this is not like all of a sudden now we're going to have two families, his family, her family. And it changes, if as we bring maybe stepchildren into that and whatever that looks like, or maybe even if there's some, new siblings, we haven't navigated that
Mhm.
as much in our relationship, but um, it has helped me to still keep that unit, that
Mhm.
dream,
Yeah.
like in honoring, I guess, that piece
Mm,
of, and it helps me to come in and still honor their
mm,
dad in the way that I choose to speak. So, like, that is, I cannot choose how he speaks about me. I
right.
cannot make that decision, but I do get to model for my kids how
Mhm.
I speak about him.
So true.
They don't get put in the middle.
Mhm.
I don't, like, what did your dad say about this? Da da da. Da. Nope. If I have questions, like that is my responsibility to figure out, whether, for me, I can go directly to their dad, but that may mean in other situations, like you need to go to the parenting coordinator or the mediator, but you're responsible. It's not your children.
Yeah.
Um, and but how you speak, even when you are frustrated or you don't know what's going on or it feels like out of your control,
Mhm.
how you show up reflects for your kids.
So true. Such good wisdom today, Miss Hannah. I appreciate you so much. I know our viewers and our listeners are going to want to connect with you, and how can they do that?
Yeah, I have a website, hannahbenedict.com, or you can find my Facebook page for my counseling practice, which is, I think it's Hannah Benedict Counseling. If you type that in, you should be able to find it. But I know you're going to link stuff as well, so that might be a little bit easier.
Yeah,
Um,
we figure there's moms here that are multitasking, doing laundry, all the
totally.
so we have you guys covered for all those links on YouTube or on any podcast platform. Well, thank you again, Hannah. I appreciate you just sharing your heart, being transparent, but also helping us dream a little bit for us us single moms that are kind of feeling like we're in the cloud, getting us excited about what's to come, the future. It's like you think about that. God designed, He has a hope and a future for us. And just because the storyline changes or the chapter looks different doesn't mean that He doesn't have something good for us. So let's cling to that promise
Amen.
and that truth today. So thank you, friend, for sharing your time with us. We appreciate you.
Sure.